Hello everyone, my name is Slade, I'll be your host, and welcome to Star Wars Did You Know? In the previous video, we talked about the Galactic Empire's TIE bomber, explored its origins, its stats, and what it was capable of overall. In this subsequent video, we're going to take a look at the TIE bomber's cousins, the various variants that the Empire introduced following the success of the core TIE bomber design. Now, it should be noted that there's no real clear timeline for when each of these craft were introduced. We know they're all based on the TIE bomber, so presumptively the TIE bomber came first, followed by each of these subsequent designs, but don't take the order of this video to indicate which craft came online first, second, or even later. The first craft we're going to look at is the TIE SH VIP shuttle, typically just known as the TIE shuttle. This was a short-range rapid transport designed to transport officers between individual Star Destroyers and other ships. It could carry up to 4 passengers. It had an expanded cargo hold as well. In addition, it had shields and life support, but was only armed with a single laser cannon. We're told that many Imperial officers disliked riding in TIE shuttles. They found the interior cramped and unluxurious, especially when compared to the larger Lambda-class shuttle that so many Imperials used throughout their career. However, when it came to quick, rapid transport between starships, very little could match the convenience of the TIE shuttle. And an interesting side note, there's a curious discrepancy between the on-screen appearance of the TIE shuttle and the wiki entries. In the old wiki entry, the TIE shuttle had the bent inwards wings, but if you look at the actual on-screen capture, the wings are clearly pointed outwards, which has been remedied on the current Disney wiki versus the old Expanded Universe wiki. And it's an interesting thing to see that there was that discrepancy between the on-screen appearance and the actual wiki itself, and it's actually nice to see that the new canon has corrected that to some degree. The next craft we have is the TIE BR boarding shuttle, also just known as the TIE boarding craft. As the name implies, it was used for boarding starships, but it could also be used for search and rescue and small-scale troop transport. It could carry about a squad of troopers in it. The usual weapons of the TIE bomber were foregone. Instead, it had a cutting tool that enabled it to cut directly into the hull of ships and enable its troops to board, as well as a tractor beam and a rear laser cannon. And unlike many TIE variants, this version, the TIE boarding craft specifically, had landing gear, which meant that it could actually land on the deck or on the surface of a planet and offload and unload both cargo and troops. Interestingly enough, this is the craft that was used by Darth Vader and his stormtroopers to board the Tantive 4 in Episode 4. We just never got to see it on screen. Next up, we have the TIE Lander, and unfortunately this one doesn't have an actual designation. It's simply called the TIE Lander. We don't know much about it. It's unclear what its armament is, whether or not it has shields or a hyperdrive. We do know is that it's a triple-hull design expanding on the original TIE bomber, with one of the hulls dedicated specifically to troop transport. And it's able to carry, we're told, about a company of stormtroopers, which are the only ones we ever see using it. So it's possible this is a stormtrooper exclusive. Unclear. It's also unclear, as I mentioned, what kind of armament it has, but we can assume, given that the craft seems to retain the munitions pod of the original TIE bomber, that while it may not have the bombing capacity of the original bomber, it possibly has the missile payload. Again, unclear, information isn't really fully provided, and unless this gets expanded on further in the future, we'll just have to go with a lot of assumptions, unfortunately. Next up, we have a return to a more traditional configuration for the TIE bomber in the form of the TIE Heavy Bomber. Now, like the previous TIE Lander, it has 3 hulls, however the configuration is slightly different. It has 2 munitions bays, and is said to have roughly double the firepower of the standard TIE bomber. Now it's unclear exactly what this means, whether or not it simply has 4 warhead launchers and the accompanying warhead magazines, or if it also has 2 different bomb magazines as well. But at the very least, given the configuration, it's safe to say that it has at least double the warhead capacity, with perhaps the same amount of bombs. Again, unclear. And given that we only ever see the TIE Heavy Bomber used in conjunction with Imperial ground forces, it is entirely possible that the TIE Heavy Bomber specifically replaced the TIE Bomber being used by ground attack wings within the Imperial Army. Next up, and wrapping up the line of Empire-specific TIE Bomber variants, we have the TIE IT Interdictor, also known simply as the Advanced TIE Bomber. This was a heavy bomber that was issued specifically to elite formations, and it was introduced shortly after the Battle of Yavin. It had heavy armor and shields, making it somewhat unusual for a TIE design. In addition, its advanced sensors enabled it to serve both a scouting role and direct targeting role. With twin-linked laser cannons, as well as 4 ordnance pods, this was one of the most heavily armed craft in the Imperial arsenal. And it's unclear exactly how much firepower this thing had, given the original TIE bomber had 2 warheads warhead launchers in one bomb bay in a single ordnance pod, it's entirely possible that the TIE interdictor has as many as 8 warhead launchers in addition to the 2 bomb bays, meaning this thing could carry perhaps the heaviest payload of any bomber used during the Galactic Civil War. Imperial doctrine dictated that the TIE interdictor be used in cases where a capital ship was at too great a risk to conduct a heavy strike. What this means exactly is unclear, but it can be assumed that the Empire would use the TIE interdictor in cases such as Hoth, where planetary defenses were perhaps a little too strong to risk a capital ship, and instead of losing a capital ship or possibly heavily damaging it, TIE interdictors would be sent in instead to level the target and enable Imperials to either wipe them out or land to capture the area. Again, unclear. Now, interestingly enough, whereas before in the TIE Bomber video we mentioned there may have been different variants specifically of the TIE Bomber, the TIE interdictor appears to have a second variant. Unclear as to what its purpose is or what the difference is, but sometime following the Battle of Endor, a variant of the TIE interdictor began to appear called the TIE CA Punisher. Now, again, it's not certain whether or not this is a renaming of the entire class of bomber, simply calling it a Punisher instead of an interdictor, maybe as some sort of psychological warfare against the New Republic, or if there was an actual internal hardware or payload difference between the original interdictor and the Punisher. A part of me wonders if perhaps the Punisher had a hyperdrive, whereas the interdictor did not, or perhaps a different warhead payload. Again, unclear, but both craft are generally known as advanced TIE Bomber. Now, for this next craft, unfortunately there is no official artwork, as it only appeared in one book that I'm aware of, but my good friend Midori was kind enough to illustrate it for me, so I can actually show you a visual representation of what this craft looks like, and you don't have to suffer through my poor art skills. This, then, would be the Gand starfighter, and while it is technically classified under what would be considered an ugly, i.e. a ship that's cobbled together from different parts, unlike many uglies, this was officially produced in this form, making it rather unique amongst uglies in that it actually functions rather well. It was a heavily modified TIE bomber, and it was used by the Gand species exclusively. It had similar cutouts in its solar arrays to the TIE Interceptor, and carried 4 laser cannons. In addition to this, it had a hyperdrive, a nav computer, and shields, in addition to a concussion missile launcher with 6 missiles. And it isn't really specified what else might have gone on with the craft beyond those points, but given other TIE variants, I would guess what happened here is that the bomb bay of the TIE bomber has been removed and replaced with the hyperdrive, the nav computer, and the shields, making this craft less of a TIE bomber and more of a TIE starfighter, just a very heavy one. Now, the final variant of the TIE bomber is not a true variant, rather it is the successor of the original TIE bomber, which would eventually replace it in Imperial service. This, then, would be the Scimitar assault bomber. Unlike most TIE designs, while the Scimitar may look similar to some degree, it actually has only a single ion engine, hence why it is not called the TIE Scimitar. It had powerful repulsive generators, which could aid it in atmospheric maneuvering, a 2-person crew, both pilot and bombardier, who could be ejected with the cockpit, which was able to jettison from the rest of the hull, 2 laser cannons, and 16 missile racks, which could carry 32 missiles total. In addition to this, it had bomb chutes for proton grenades and thermal detonators, making it a very deadly bombing platform. It was developed during the Thrawn campaign around 9 ABY, however it did not see widespread adoption given its price until much later during the Imperial Remnants era. Specifically, it didn't fully phase out the TIE bomber until around the time of the Yuuzhan Vong War, and even then, not until the first few years of that war had transpired. And that wraps up all the different versions and variants of the TIE bomber. As you can see, the Empire did not sit idly by and let a good design go to waste. They developed several different versions, both in the offensive capacity and in utility capacity. What do you think about the TIE bomber? Do you like the craft itself, or do you think one of its successors was a much better platform, or at least one you'd be more interested in seeing more of? As always, I've been your host, Slade. This has been Star Wars Did You Know? And I hope you enjoyed it.